Hello, I'm Org, and in this video I would like to talk a bit about the cruisers, and in particular the different varieties of cruiser that we have in World of Warships at the moment. Of the four classes of ship represented in the game, cruisers have by far the most variety, and that is because they were designed to fit kind of a number of roles. Their primary roles fit into three categories. They were initially designed for convoy raiding, or essentially disrupting your enemy's merchant shipping, and likewise protecting your convoys. And their third major duty was as scouts for the major fleet. And kind of as a result of these, there were lots of different ways of designing cruisers to fit these roles that were better at some respects, worse at some respects, did some things well, did other things better and worse, whatever. And so I've kind of divided the cruisers into kind of four broad categories that we can use to discuss them, and I would just like to take you through them. And first of all, we'll start with the protected cruisers. These ships were they were kind of a late 19th century design. Essentially, late 19th century navies had kind of realised that sticking armour plating on ships was essentially very good at making them survive longer in combat. But the downside of this was that they were far too slow to actually do any of the convoy raiding or scouting or convoy protection jobs that the cruisers tended to do. So they came up with a novel solution to this problem, which was to essentially put all the important bits of the ship, the magazines, the engines, what else, the rudder, some control facilities, whatever, stick them way down below the waterline, which also it lowered the ship's centre of gravity, made them more stable, and above these things they put an armoured deck, and that was the only armour that these ships tended to have. And the idea was that at long ranges, when shells were coming directly down on top of the ship, that would act just like regular armour, as it was a nice flat surface that would ideally stop the shell before it got to somewhere important. And at closer ranges, when shells were kind of coming in horizontally, the armoured deck, the shells would hit the armoured deck at a very shallow angle, which would give it a very high effective thickness. Meaning that essentially, for a relatively small weight of armour, the designers were able to get a very high effective thickness of armour and able to protect these ships against enemy ships that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So these protected cruisers, they're very old designs. There are only, depending on what you call a protected cruiser, kind of 3 or 4 or 5 designs in the game at the moment, all at low tiers. They've all got decent speed, kind of mid-20-ish knots. Actually, probably a few of them are a bit slower than that, but they do alright for speed. They're faster than merchant ships, probably a bit faster than the pre-Dreadnought battleships that they were designed to scout for. And they've got kind of light guns, but, as you can see here, and you can't see there because I all missed, but they do alright at damaging other ships. But really, they are basically just good all-round cruisers. That armoured deck does actually provide a fair bit of protection, or at least you don't seem to get very many citadel hits when you are either shooting at these ships or driving one of them, compared to, say, the light cruisers in particular. But you've got the guns, you've got the speed. As I said, it's basically just an average cruiser. See here, I thought for a second I was going to ram this guy, but not quite. Managed to get round, and then we trade broadsides. And of course, we are both Jakumas, we are both armoured cruisers, and it's just going to be a case of who can kill each other first then. Well, actually, no, I've got a pretty huge advantage because this guy's basically already dead.
Critical engine damage.
But as you see, I'm not penetrating its armour because, to be honest, I'm probably over-penetrating at this point. It's got no armour on the superstructure, it's only the armoured deck. So my shells are probably passing straight through. Got one decent hit shot there, managed to penetrate, but not anything particularly important. When I say penetrate, I mean the shell exploded inside the ship is probably a better way of saying it.
We've destroyed an enemy cruiser.
And there we go. nice easy kill, and that's the protected cruisers. Next up we have the armoured cruisers, which, depending on how you count them, there's either no armoured cruisers or a single armoured cruiser in the game. I have decided to call the St. Louis a armoured cruiser, just so I can really talk about them. The devs have said that armoured cruisers, proper armoured cruisers, will be in the game at some point, so I thought I should talk about them anyway. Basically, armoured cruisers were kind of an evolution in the design of protected cruisers. Basically, as armour and engine technologies developed, they realised that they could again go back to sticking lots of armour onto these cruisers and still get decent enough speeds. And that's basically what the armoured cruiser is. It's got the armoured deck of a protected cruiser, plus a belt and citadels and casemates and all the other bits of armour that warships have. And basically, well, from a historical perspective, people tend to dislike armoured cruisers. They were, well, as a general rule, like of the roles I'm looking at, you've got commerce raiding. They were way too armoured for that role, and they were slow and expensive to use. Same as convoy defence, they were slow and expensive, and were just way too powerful for defending convoys. Like a light cruiser could essentially do the same job at half the cost. And scouting, they were just too slow. They were at about the same speed as the battleships that they were supposed to be scouting for. But armoured cruisers had kind of one more role, which was they were actually expected to fight in the main line of battle alongside the battleships. Now, essentially it was based on the idea of pre-dreadnought battleships, which had lots of kind of 8 or 9 inch secondary guns to help sink enemy battleships, which were basically the same caliber guns that they put on armoured cruisers. And since these were, major fleet battles were expected to happen at fairly close ranges, there wasn't really any reason not to put armoured cruisers into the battle line. Historically, when they did do that, it actually didn't end well for the armoured cruisers, but that's because they were mostly fighting dreadnought battleships at ranges where they couldn't really effectively engage them, or battle cruisers, which is another class of cruiser that's really not a battleship, but whatever. The St. Louis here, I've put it in as an armoured cruiser because it's got a belt and heavily armoured, it's slow, and it's basically got all the characteristics of an armoured cruiser. But in the game they actually call it a protected cruiser, and it was designed as a protected cruiser that they just added armour to. And it's really a very bad example of an armoured cruiser, because while it's got the speed of an armoured cruiser, it's probably only got about half the armour that an armoured cruiser would have, and smaller guns than most armoured cruisers have. This one has, I want to say 6 inch guns, whereas most armoured cruisers had 8 or 9 inch guns. But it's got the basic idea of the armoured cruiser down, in that this is a ship that's designed to basically get up real close to enemy ships and just unload on them with lots of guns and destroy them and just bounce off enemy fire. Kind of a development of the armoured cruiser was the light cruiser. Essentially, armoured cruisers effectively made protected cruisers obsolete, as in they could go at pretty similar speeds to protected cruiser. Protected cruiser was always going to have the speed advantage, but as turbine, in particular engine technology, developed, they realised they could start sticking, belt armour and everything else onto protected cruisers and still get the same speed. And that's essentially where the light cruisers come from. It was originally called light armoured cruisers to signify that they did have the armour of an armoured cruiser. Just less of it, and it was designed more for speed than being able to survive in combat. These light cruisers, they tend to be armed with small guns. Probably, bigger than destroyer guns, but not particularly large guns. But the guns are rapid firing, and they traverse very rapidly, which, when combined with the light cruiser's manoeuvrability, means that these are the ideal ships for hunting down enemy destroyers or even aircraft carriers as well. Basically, unless you are very unlucky or you're really not paying attention, light cruisers are pretty near to immune to torpedo attacks. So going up against aircraft carriers or destroyers, unless you're at point blank range, is not really an issue for these ships. However, unlike destroyers, they actually have a bit of armour and a bit of hit points, combat capacity, so they can actually survive in combat for a while. I mean, downside is they're nowhere near as stealthy, and what was I say? Nowhere near as stealthy, and they're not actually as manoeuvrable. But it still does the trick. I should also mention light cruisers are my favourite class of ship in the game. Just because I enjoy the manoeuvrability, I enjoy the speed, I enjoy the flexibility the firepower gives you. The guns are a bit weak for going up against battleships, but you can always switch to high explosive and help out your team who are actually capable of hurting them. But fortunately my team kills that battleship there for me. Oh, and also, most light cruisers have torpedoes. I think there is 2 exceptions in the game, both Americans who they just went off torpedoes. Anyway, the final class of cruiser I'm going to talk about are the heavy cruisers. These are again a development of the light cruisers. Essentially, particularly during the First World War, but probably before then, the armoured cruiser concept had gone out of favour and instead was replaced by the battle cruiser, which, as I said earlier, was basically a scaled down battleship rather than a cruiser. And essentially at the end of the war, the only cruisers being made were light cruisers, which were basically good at scouting and commerce raiding. But in kind of, well, I suppose the later years of the First World War and into the 1920s, people started realising that they needed a ship that was essentially capable of beating the light cruisers at convoy defence. Well, you know, light cruisers will attack the convoys, you need something to defend the convoys from light cruisers that was a lot cheaper to build than battleships. And kind of heavy cruisers developed out of that. They were kind of just upgunned light cruisers, but because of the naval treaties of the 1920s and 30s, they ended up being defined as something different, and they were actually defined by the size of their guns. But yes, in the game the heavy cruisers are slower than light cruisers, they have bigger guns, guns don't have the rate of fire or traverse that the light cruiser guns do, so they aren't quite as good at, say, tracking destroyers or keeping up with enemy targets at close range, or even with your ship's manoeuvring. But as you can see here, they are very effective at tearing apart unarmoured ships like this poor Kuma class light cruiser.
The enemy team has taken the
And the secondary role that heavy cruisers have, and well, really all cruisers got towards the Second World War more than anything, is in defending friendly capital ships against enemy aircraft, which you see me trying to do here, but really I am much too far away to help that battleship. Although I shot down a single enemy aircraft. The Alba and the Japanese cruisers in general, they're actually good at shooting down aircraft, but compared to the American cruisers, they aren't great. But yes, as you see here, heavy cruisers, more manoeuvrable than battleships, but they're not particularly manoeuvrable. And the turret traverse means they're basically a bit like small battleships rather than light cruisers, which are, I suppose, in the same comparison, they're big destroyers. But yes, I see the heavy cruisers' role in this game mainly as escorting battleships and trying to kill destroyers and aircraft that could hurt the battleship, and also adding your firepower to the battleships when it's engaging other battleships or heavy cruisers. Whereas the light cruiser, because of its speed and manoeuvrability, can take a more independent role than the heavy cruiser. However, heavy cruisers have a lot more armour and combat capability, so they can also operate independently, but just in a different way. Anyway, that's kind of the cruisers, and well, there's a lot more I could go into. If there's a few controversial categorizations I've seen, or you would have seen in there if you know a bit about ships, but I know I'll talk about them later, I suppose. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all next time.